Good morning, and welcome again to Inquisition Update. My name's Tom Fress, and I'll be your host for the next hour. You're listening to FirstAmendmentRadio.com. Thanks for tuning in. And now we'll continue where we left off yesterday in the book, The Papacy and the Civil Power, by R.W. Thompson, beginning in the last full paragraph, page 466, if you're following along in the book. The barons and the people of England continue to struggle against the king and the pope of the land to secure their own liberties and to put down the encroachment of those liberties by the king and the pope and the ecclesiastical powers that were ruling in the king's court. He says the barons would have been unworthy of the name Englishmen if they had not resisted these encroachments upon the rights and the liberties of the people, with those interests and happiness of their own whose interests and happiness of their own had now become inseparably identified. Now, R.W. Thompson is telling us that these barons were once Norman. Okay? When they were first brought to England, they were from Normandy. And they had no filial relationship with the indigenous people of England. They were imports. They were foreigners. And they were brought to impose the Pope's will upon the recalcitrant natives of England, the Britons and the Saxons, the Bible-believing Britons and the Saxons. Now, these Normans, Roman Catholics, were on the side originally of the Pope and the King, but now there has been a melding of the minds of these Norman barons and that of the freedom-loving people, and their bond has grown to a degree as to be almost inseparable. Okay. The reciprocal hatred which had once existed between the Anglo-Saxons and the Normans had, like that between the native Britons and the Saxons, given way before the sense of common injuries and the threatened loss of their common liberties. To the stubborn tenacity with which the Anglo-Saxons adhered to their Teutonic principles, the country was indebted for this. They had gradually worn away the Norman prejudices and had retained their own language and enough of their ancient laws and customs to furnish an ultimate barrier against the encroachment of kings and popes, their common and implacable enemies. The barons realizing this, firmly maintained their ground on the side of the people, and resolved upon grappling royalty itself by the throat if its hold upon the country could not otherwise be broken. The struggle was one which called for an exhibition of the highest and noblest qualities of English character. The ancient liberties were to be snatched from the grasp of royal and papal imperialism and given back again to the people from whom they had been wrenched by usurpation, to be sacredly preserved as belonging of right to every Englishman and as the foundation of the world's future progress. The firmness and resolution of the barons constrained the king to grant important concessions. 24 commissioners were appointed, one half by the king and the other by the barons, to provide redress for the public grievances. These provided for the confirmation of the Great Charter, the Magna Carta, and the introduction for the first time of the representatives of the commons, that is, of the people, into Parliament. A measure, imperfect as it was then, which was based upon the natural and inalienable right of the people to give or withhold their consent to all laws by which it is proposed to govern them. The Parliament, thus brought under popular influence, approved what had been done by the commissioners and provided for the execution of the articles they had drawn up. Beneficial results immediately followed. They were first seen in the expulsion from the country of the army of foreigners who, by the joint policy of the king and the popes, had been imported to fill the offices, consume the wealth of the people, and keep them in bondage to the papal power. So the first thing these new liberties enabled the people to do was to get rid of the foreign ecclesiastics that the Pope had injected into the country, that had no love or fealty or any bond whatsoever, either to England or to its people, and simply imposed Roman Catholic canon law through the government. They were the first to go. Now, if the United States were to do the same thing today, what would the equivalent of it be? The expulsion of the Jesuit order and all the other ecclesiastical orders of the Roman Catholic Church, foreigners whose first allegiance is not to the government of this country nor to its people, but to the Pope of Rome and the imposition of Roman Catholic canon law. The first to go, were this to take place in the United States, would be the Jesuit order. Now, they kicked them out of England, and it says this accomplished, not the Jesuits. The Jesuits had not been formulated yet at this time, but the papacy was using the strategy, as she does today through the Jesuits, to use foreign ecclesiastics to impose the Pope's will wherever he wants to impose it in the world, in this case England. And it says once this accomplished, the barons formed another alliance and swore to maintain their liberties with their lives and fortunes. The city of London joined the alliance. The king, however, in the meantime, fearing the loss of his royal prerogatives and the consequent elevation of the people, appealed to the Pope to absolve him from the oath he had taken to abide by his compact with the barons. So here we have again the divine writers getting together and absolving one another of their loyalties to the people. This is what it's all about, the divine right of kings. You can't hold a divine writer to any oath. If the Pope absolves a king from an oath taken to preserve the rights of the people, then there are no rights of the people. The Pope is, as it were, God on earth. And if the papacy wants to bring the people into subjection to the papacy, and to accomplish that, to destroy all their rights, the Pope simply absolves the king of any oath that he took to preserve those rights. Now, this absolution was readily granted by Pope Alexander IV, but as he died before any effective measures had been consummated, it was confirmed by Pope Urban IV, who was as little scrupulous upon this subject as any of his predecessors. Thus, supported by the Church, the king announced to Parliament that he would not observe his oath and took immediate steps to recover the prerogatives he had lost by surrender to the barons. The barons were unyielding, and they and the king both prepared for civil war. To avoid this, however, if possible, the barons petitioned the king to adopt conciliatory measures, which he finally consented to do to an extent satisfactory to them. But the king soon broke his promise again, as he could easily do at any time by the help of the Pope, and the parties again made preparations for war. The king at last began active hostilities by surprising Dover Castle, which was in the hands of the barons. Before any decisive result was reached, however, it was agreed to refer the matter to the King of France as an arbiter, a measure which reflects more credit upon the peaceful disposition of the barons than it does upon their sagacity. Now, what's R.W. Thompson telling us here? He's telling us that to simply let the King of France arbitrate in this matter is is the same as letting the Pope arbitrate in this manner. The French king was a devout son of the Roman Catholic Church, and it was an ignorant move on the behalf of the barons. Obviously a desperate attempt to avoid civil war. And it says, as might have been expected, the French king fully sustained his royal brother of England, the King of England, having precisely the same motive for keeping the people in subjection and being equally under the influence of the Pope. So he's a papist. The barons asked a papist, a divine writer, to mediate in this affair. It was a terrible mistake. And it says, he, that is the French king, decided that the provisions of the 24 commissioners were null and void, that the king should be restored to his former power, that he should appoint all the great officers of the crown, and that foreigners should be as capable of holding offices in England as the Englishmen themselves. Consent to this on the part of the barons would have buried English liberty in its grave forever. Therefore, civil war became inevitable. At the beginning of it, fortune seemed to favor the cause of the king, but he was finally taken prisoner when the barons drew up a new plan of government for the extension and security of their liberties. By this plan, conservators were appointed in each county to preserve the privileges of the people, and these were required to nominate knights to sit in Parliament as the representatives of their shires, thus laying the foundation for popular legislative representation. The Parliament, elected pursuant to this plan, adopted important measures for reform for the promotion of the public welfare and greatly reduced the prerogatives of the king. While the government was thus conducted, it made a nearer approach to the popular form than any other that had existed in England after the popes had obtained a foothold there, and embodied many of the Teutonic principles brought there by the Saxons. The king, however, having subsequently obtained his liberty, the barons suffered a severe defeat, which changed the whole aspect of affairs. After this, the barons were persecuted, quote, 1,000 ways, unquote, and made to, quote, endure many hardships, unquote, says the historian. Their estates were confiscated. The city of London was required to deliver up her magistrates and pay large sums of money. The king conferred the estates of the barons upon his favorites, and left no means untried to punish them for their resistance to his authority. Pope Clement IV, to convince the people that the barons had forfeited their claim to his protection and secured to themselves the certainty of eternal perdition because they had struggled to regain the ancient liberties of the country, sent over a legate with a bull of excommunication against them and all their adherents, dead or alive. That's right. Did you know the Pope has the right to and the power to condemn you to the eternal flames of perdition even after you're dead? And it says, thus, with only their lives and limbs saved, these defenders of human freedom against the encroachments of kingly and pontifical absolutism were compelled to lay down their arms and go back among the people, to keep alive in their minds the principles for which they had risked so much. And they were kept alive, cherished in the hearts of the English people, until the time came for their final triumph. We can scarcely realize now, in the midst of our own prosperity, how much we owe to these firm and courageous old heroes, who for nearly half a century held out against both kings and popes. But for them, the ancient liberties of England would have been lost, and the world would have been kept in the midnight of the Middle Ages. But for them, the reign of King John would have been redeemed by no such event as the establishment of the Great Charter to save it from the disgrace and treachery and imbecility. And but for them, the present civil and religious freedom of England and the United States might have had no such foundation as has enabled it thus far to defy assault and stand firm against encroachment. Truth and candor require that full justice should be done to these old Roman Catholic barons who obeyed God and their own consciences rather than corrupt popes and ecclesiastics. They loved their religion, but they loved freedom also. And for loving freedom, they were cursed, anathematized, and despoiled by the Church of Rome. They did not believe the Pope to be infallible, and for this they were consigned to the eternal torment in the world to come. But the barons made so bold a stand against imperialism that from the time of this memorial contest to the birth of the Protestant Reformation in England, no king dared again arouse the popular indignation by an armed assault upon the defenders of the Great Charter. The fear of the people began to manifest itself in their conduct and policy. They conceded only what they could not withhold, and together with the popes, employed art and intrigue to accomplish by indirection what they dared not attempt to gain or obtain by force. Edward I confirmed the charter at the beginning of his reign in order to conciliate popular favor. And although he had pretended to do it, quote, of his own accord, unquote, he soon asked the Pope to absolve him from his promise, religion and the church being used solely to the advantage of the temporal ends of the kings and popes. The Pope absolved him, of course, not merely because of his hostility to the charter on account of its enfranchisement of the people, but because it is said the king made a plate of pure gold, unquote. Bribery, right? Let me tell you what is even more valuable than gold to the papacy is the extension of his temporal power, because that's the source of the gold mine for the papacy, the extension of his temporal power. Now, Edward II pledged himself to Parliament that its provisions should be faithfully kept, and when he sought to escape the fulfillment of his promise, the barons seized him and held him to his word. Yet he recognized himself as the vassal of the Pope and suffered him to interfere in the temporal affairs of his kingdom. This the Pope did by sending a legate to England with a papal commission to make peace between the country and Scotland, to excommunicate both kings and place both countries under interdict if they refused obedience, thus assuming that all the prerogatives of both crowns belonged to him, the Pope, as the vicar of Christ. Edward III, in order to obtain a subsidy from Parliament, again confirmed the charter and indicated a wish to curtail the authority of the Pope by consequently repeating his act of confirmation and by consenting to the statute of provisors to prohibit the popes from dispensing of benefices in England. This statute, however, was not effective against the machinations of the popes, and although several times repeated under subsequent kings, its terms had to be enlarged by the statute of Praemunire before any good was accomplished by it. Now, what was the statute of Praemunire? The author gives us a note here. He says, the statute of provisors provided that no ecclesiastical living should be accepted from the Pope, and that nothing should be sent to him out of the kingdom. By that of Praemunire, all bulls, excommunications, etc., against the king or the crown or the realm proceeding from Rome were prohibited. So between these two provisions, that of Praemunire and provisors simply kicked the Pope completely out of English affairs. Okay, you can about imagine that the popes rejected this. Now, it says everything done by these kings was by way of concession to the people on account of fear, showing that they were apprehensive that their royal rights were held by a precarious tenure, and that the people only awaited a favorable opportunity to assert their ancient liberties. During all the subsequent reigns between that time and the accession of Henry VIII, these liberties were suspended, but not forgotten. If there had been no other method of preservation, they would have been traditionally preserved in the English mind. The 130 years embraced in that period were distinguished by many events of the most important character to England and to the world. The fortunes of the people seem sometimes to be almost overwhelmed by the combined oppressions of kings and popes, but their cause was never at any time entirely lost. Providence will shape our ends, quote, roughly hew them how we will, unquote, and when the popes, as the head of the church, grasped a temporal sword and stained it with the blood of pious Christians for no other offense than the worship of God according to their own consciences, they called down the wrath of heaven upon their own heads and aided in building up a party of reform in the Roman Catholic Church. As early as the reign of Richard II, incipient steps were taken in this work of reform, showing that the Roman Catholic Church never was without pious and devout Christians among its members. The measures then inaugurated ultimately gave birth to Protestantism. Slowly, it is true, but surely. Although in 1381 an act was passed in obedience to Rome authorizing the imprisonment of heretics by the bishops, yet the House of Commons forced a repeal of it during the next year. The passage of such an act, however, shows that Rome was ready to place her heel of iron upon the necks of any who dared consult their own consciences upon questions of religious faith. She would repeat those measures today if she again possessed the power, and therefore they teach us a valuable and most instructive lesson. This inauguration of religious persecution was designed for the suppression of the Lollards, or the followers of John Wycliffe, who published his Reformed doctrines in the year 1377 during the reign of Edward III. These new doctrines had so spread among the people in a few years that while Richard II was carrying on his war in England, the Archbishop of York and the Bishop of London were compelled to entreat him to return and look after the cause of religion. He had fires burning at home. They had to return to help put out the light of the Protestant Reformation that was embodied in the Lollards, started by Wycliffe, the great Protestant reformer. That was more important. To shut out the gospel of Jesus Christ. We'll be back right after this.
The book of Revelation says, "The spirit of prophecy is the testimony of Jesus Christ." This is at the very heart of FirstAmendmentRadio.com. In that spirit, we have created the Prophecy Reality News app for all of your mobile devices, streaming First Amendment Radio 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Available for your Apple, Android device, and smartphone, absolutely free. Get the Prophecy Reality News app installed today so you can listen to First Amendment Radio wherever you are. The Prophecy Reality News app. Get it now. Visit crosstheborder.org, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. That's crosstheborder.org.
I know you all want answers, and believe me, so do I, and I'll do my best to get them.
Despite Nicolas Cage's promise to do his best to get left behind rapture answers for us, don't hold your breath. Not everyone believes Left Behind is true prophecy. Some may even regard as conspiratorial the mainstream re-release of the Left Behind movie with actor Nicolas Cage portraying the main character as an attempt to further reinforce in the minds of all this perception of false prophecy in order to condition the masses for the play about to begin. If you want true Bible prophecy answers, get the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. The author exposes the Latin rapture origin, the 7-year tribulation deception, true Bible revelation of Daniel's 70 weeks, the abomination of desolation, the restrainer, America in the Revelation, the image of the beast and the mark of the beast, and the truth about God's chosen people, and so much more about Bible prophecy. This book will shatter the Left Behind paradigm of future events. Get the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. Visit crosstheborder.org, CROSS, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. That's crosstheborder.org.
Okay, we'll continue now here on Inquisition Update with the reading of the book, The Papacy and the Civil Power. But before we do, I want to remind the listeners that the new web page is up and coming along slowly but nicely, I think. And if you would like to check that out, you can go to the old website address, inquisitionupdate.org, and peruse of the writing there, and we'll add to the archives as time permits. And we invite your questions and comments and your prayers mostly. And if you'd also would like to contact me via email, you may do so at tom@seawaves.us. tom@seawaves.us. Now continuing, it says, this inauguration of religious persecution was designed for the suppression of the Lollards, or followers of John Wycliffe, who published his Reform doctrines in the year 1377 during the reign of Edward III. These new doctrines had so spread among the people in a few years that while Richard II was carrying on his war in Ireland, the Archbishop of York and the Bishop of London were compelled to entreat him to return and look after the cause of religion. That's right, fires were burning at home. The fire of the Holy Spirit through the written Word of God, through the Protestant reformer John Wycliffe, was starting a reformation in the church. And this divine writer, this king, had to come back and to quench that gospel before it spread too far. It says the immediate cause of their alarm was that at the late Parliament, the Lollards had suggested the necessity for reform in the church. The king returned, seized upon one of the Lollards, compelled him to abjure the new doctrines, and threatened him with death if he again professed them. Now a new and powerful element began its work, one which the people readily saw would enable them to achieve their ultimate freedom. There was yet no law to punish heresy, and therefore John Wycliffe was unmolested, and his followers among the people increased with wonderful rapidity. Even his death did not dishearten them. And as early as the year 1389, they began to separate from the Roman Catholic Church and to appoint their own priests, thus beginning the Reformation. So rapidly did they increase that Rome had to bring forth the most fearful engines of her power to suppress their free thought and chain down their limbs. The reign of Henry IV was soon signalized by the enactment of a law, quote, for the burning of heretics, unquote. a most Christian and truly Roman mode of disposing the Lollards. Under this act, William Sauter, a Lollard, was immediately convicted by an ecclesiastical court and burned to death, thus becoming the first English martyr after the monks of Bangor to the cause of religious liberty. Then Rome rejoiced, and the cruel and bloody work of persecution began. The fires were kindled, which were to consume hundreds more of the best of England's sons, of men whose only crime was that they dared assert that God had given to every man the right to worship him according to the dictates of his own conscience. Thomas Badby, another Lollard, was burned in 1410. When offered his life if he would recant, he refused and suffered death with heroic courage. During the reign of Henry V, the Romish clergy held a convocation to decide upon measures necessary to check the progress of the doctrines of Wycliffe, which resulted in the king's being advised by the Archbishop of Canterbury that, quote, fire and faggot were the only means of extirpating heresy, unquote. This was the doctrine of Rome, and I will interject, it is still the doctrine of Rome, announced by its highest ecclesiastic in England, the Archbishop of Canterbury. You might imagine that every archbishop in the United States of America has the same loyalty to the Pope and disdain for the Word of God and those who utter it, called heretics, to be burned, extirpated, and annihilated according to the Council of Trent. He continues, he says, but the king was slow to adopt it, as the new doctrines were spreading so rapidly as to excite his fears of the people. He, however, advanced toward it as near as he thought he could safely do, by issuing a proclamation prohibiting the Lollards from holding meetings. Is that happening in the United States today? Have you ever heard of the cops shutting down local house churches around the country? That's happening today, and that's what's happening here. It says, he, however, advanced toward it as nearly as possible that he could safely do by issuing a proclamation prohibiting the Lollards from holding meetings and the people from being present at their preaching. But the Lollards held their meetings notwithstanding the proclamation, and at one of them, held at St. Gillies Field near London, it was represented that 20,000 were present, supposed to be under Sir John Oldcastle, who had been previously convicted of heresy and would have been burned if he had not escaped. Being unable to suppress these peaceful assemblages of the people, you hear those words, peaceful assemblages? That's embodied in our Bill of Rights. The people have the right to peaceably assemble in house churches. Okay? Those house churches that are being torn down in this country are being torn down in violation of the express will of the writers of our Bill of Rights, which are based on the Magna Carta, which provide us liberties against the encroachments of popes and kings. And whenever the government, whenever any law enforcement agency in this country shuts down a house church, they're acting upon the ancient authority of the papacy through the civil power. It says, being unable to suppress these peaceful assemblages of the people, the clergy adopted another method for their extermination by persuading the king to believe that the Lollards had a design upon his life and were conspiring against the government, a method which it required the corrupt followers of the papacy to invent. So they simply went around accusing these people of being domestic terrorists. It's deja vu all over again, isn't it? Might we suspect that what's going on in the United States today is a direct result of papal influence? I assert to my listeners that it is. And it says, the king yielded to their importunities, summoned a body of armed men, closed the gates of London for fear the people there would go out to help the Lollards, surprised about 80 peaceful and praying Christians at midnight, cruelly murdered 20 of them, and made prisoners of the other 60, some of whom were forthwith executed, and the remainder set at liberty. During the reign of Edward IV, the clergy regained much of their lost power, and again began to press more heavily and severely upon the people. In 1462, an act was passed under dictation from Rome, providing that they should only be tried in ecclesiastical courts and should not be held responsible for crimes before civil tribunals. Here we're talking about the immunity of the priests again. Anytime the church gets powerful, it demands immunity from the civil laws of the land. That's how we've got so many pedophile priests running around the country, just not going to jail, but just moving from one diocese to another, or one nation to another. They're protected by the Pope because they only answer to the Pope. They're not held accountable by the people through the civil power, through the civil courts of the land. It's happening all over again. Right here in the United States of America, these things that we're reading about the history of England are being reproduced right here in America, right before our very eyes, and we simply must recognize what the root cause of all of this is. It is the papacy. Now, we can criticize our governments, we can take issue with the Republicans, or we can take issue with the Democrats, but we miss the mark. Engaging in discussions of partisan politics is only a stopgap measure. It's all smoke and mirrors. This isn't a Democratic problem or a Republican problem. It's a government problem. It's a papal problem. The Pope controls politics, both Democratic and Republican. With every swing of the political pendulum in this country, the second hand of the Pope advances the same direction all the time. The Pope lies at the very root of all the problems currently being discussed in this country. And it's being discussed under the guise of Democratic versus Republican politics, and it completely misses the mark. Continuing, it says, the king also released them from the operation of the statutes of provisors and praemunire. So the Pope's back in business. You can't shut the Pope out, right? And it says, but all these measures, while they added to the power of the Romish clergy in England, also increased their corruptions. What was it Lord Acton said? Power corrupts, but absolute power corrupts absolutely. You can just gauge by the corruptions of the Roman Catholic priests just how much power and authority they have in our government. It is just an indelible mark, an indelible indicator of the power of the priesthood in the Roman Catholic Church when the priests become corrupt. And I dare say that there's never been a time in American history when the Roman Catholic priesthood has been so corrupt. And why are they corrupt? They're no longer answerable to anyone but their Pope. They have absolute power, both in the churches and in our government. And it says these corruptions were so openly and unblushingly practiced as to put in striking contrast their conduct with that of the reforming Christians. And by this means the number of the latter continually increased, especially among those who had so long struggled to maintain the great charter and the ancient liberties. And thus these popular elements were consolidated into a power which persecution could not destroy, but which was destined to be preserved until it became strong enough to control the policy of the English nation and influence the whole civilized world. The finger of providence was wonderfully displayed in the events which immediately preceded and followed this beginning of the Reformation, under the inspiration of the new doctrines announced by Wycliffe, in so exhibiting to the world the ambition and corruption of the papacy as to demonstrate the necessity for the restoration of the ancient liberties in England, in order that the English people, by the aid of their cultivated reason, might discover the true teachings of the apostolic Christians and restore Christianity to the purity it enjoyed before Constantine tempted the bishops of Rome to mingle in the temporal concern of princes. It was but a little while before when Pope Urban V was shut up for, quote, whole days, unquote, in the Palace of the Vatican with the infamous Joanna of Naples, and rewarded this, quote-unquote, crowned courtesan for her favors by presenting her with, quote, the golden rose, unquote, at the public ceremony of its blessing. It was during the pontificate of Gregory XI that Wycliffe attacked the ultramontane doctrines. One of the first acts of this pope was to issue a bull against Barnabo, one of the hated Visconti who had caused the arrest of the Bishop of Milan, denouncing him because he had refused his subjects permission to go to Rome, quote, to purchase indulgences, benefices, and absolutions, unquote. And when Barnabo made overtures of peace to him, he refused them, saying, quote, no, it is useless for me to see them. I will spare them from perjury and will save their souls in spite of themselves by causing them to be interred alive, that is, buried alive, if they fall into my hands, unquote. He directed the Vaudois to be exterminated by armed troops and by his infernal inquisitors. He wrote to the Bishop of London to put Wycliffe, quote, to the torture, unquote, and rejoiced as the devouring flames consumed the bodies of thousands of Christians whom he called heretics. The 14th century closed with 3 popes, each excommunicating the others, and the 15th century began with 2, one of whom caused the other to be poisoned. For more than a quarter of a century there were popes and anti-popes, some at Rome, others at Avignon in France at the same time, who denounced each other to the scandal of all Christendom, until pure-minded Christians all over Europe blushed for shame. Pope Gregory XII was pope at Rome, while Benedict XIII was also pope in Avignon in France. The, quote, sacred college, unquote, of cardinals assembled at Rome said of Gregory that he was, quote, an accursed pope, unquote, because he desired to murder several of them. They called him the coward, the drunkard, and the knave, the man of blood, the illustrious robber, the schismatic, the heretic, the precursor of Antichrist, unquote, who had, quote, mounted the chair of the apostle like a thief to set fire to the 4 corners of the house of God and to pull down its columns, unquote. And of Benedict they said that he was, quote, a worthy co-partner, unquote, of Gregory, quote, in his work of violence and iniquity, unquote. Again, I remind the listeners that the level of corruption in the papacy is equivalent to their power over the kings of the earth and their immunity from man's law and the law of nations, and most importantly, the law of God Almighty. It says they also charged Gregory with, quote, an incestuous amour with his own sister, unquote, and called his chamberlains the purveyors of his, quote, hideous lubricity, unquote. And the Council of Pisa confirmed the iniquity of both these infallible popes, deposed both of them from their sacerdotal functions, and elected another, who took the name Alexander V. In the sentence of the council, it is declared that, quote, these two infamous men are guilty of enormous iniquities and excesses, unquote. Alexander V died of poison when John the 23rd, quote, broke the pontifical gate with a golden axe, unquote, and was crowned as Pope in Rome. So much for the Holy Spirit being the one that seats the popes. It says the Ecumenical Council of Constance soon met and deposed John, declared that he was, quote, the oppressor of the poor, the persecutor of the just, the support of knaves, the idol of simoniacs, the slave of the flesh, a sink of vices, a man destitute of every virtue, a mirror of infamy, a devil incarnate, unquote. Kind of sounds like Antichrist, doesn't it? 54 articles enumerating his crimes were publicly read, and 20 other secret ones were not read. So frightful were the crimes which they announced. This council, after acquiring for itself an undesirable notoriety by condemning John Huss for heresy, elected a new pope, Martin V. Pope Gregory XII finally submitted to the decree of deposition, and so did John the 23rd, who retired to a fortress. But there still remained two successors of Peter, Martin V and Benedict XIII. The latter lived as pope in Valencia for about 10 years, and after his death his cardinals elected Clement VIII as his successor. But he was finally induced to abdicate in favor of Martin V, and thus to put an end to the corrupt and degrading quarrels about papal sovereignty at Rome, which had made all the parties concerned for half a century contemptible in the eyes of the world. No wonder that God so directed his providences that the lovers of true Christianity within the pale of the Roman Catholic Church should see these and other kindred enormities of the papacy. This old church, hallowed by an existence of nearly 1,500 years, yet retained within her fold many thousands of devoted and pious Christians who had escaped the contamination and the corruption which had so long prevailed among the leading hierarchy. How their hearts must have bled when they saw her led away by these debasing influences of the papal system, so far from the apostolic counsels she had once followed. How sad they must have been when, looking back through the last 1,000 years, they beheld her gradually descending from her high eminence down into the corruptions at which papal Rome would have blushed, and soiling her sacred and once unspotted robes with the slime and filth of worldly politics. And how natural it was then for them, acting in consistency with their understanding of religious duty, to begin the work of reformation, and to desire the eradication of these abuses and the extraction of the poison that was coursing through her veins, slowly but steadily consuming her strength. Many of them must have felt as one of that church, referring to times subsequent to those of which we are now writing, expressing himself when he said, quote, the 15th century, however, surpassed all the preceding ages in corruption. The churches became the resorts of robbers, sodomites, and assassins. Popes, cardinals, bishops, and mere clerks exercised brigandage forcibly in the provinces, and employed, as was most convenient, poison, the sword, and fire to free themselves from their enemies and despoil their victims. The Inquisition lent its horrible ministry to popes and kings. In France, Spain, Italy, Germany, and England, It embraced in its 1,000 arms the victims of the cupidity of the tyrants and put them to the most frightful tortures. The country was covered with legions of priests and monks who devoured the substance of the people and carried off to their impure retreats young girls and handsome youths, whom they again cast out, disgraced and dishonored. You see, pedophilia, priestly pedophilia, has been an indelible, consistent, and permanent fixture in the Roman Catholic priesthood. And I've explained this many times on the program, and I won't do it again, but the source of that pedophilia is an unnatural affection called sodomy. And they achieve that unnatural affection because they have an unnatural affection for idolatry. Idols, the worship of men, the worship of the works of their own hands, the papacy, and images and idols and such like. The punishment perfectly fits the crime. It is a mirror image of the crime, and it is no wonder to anyone who understands his scriptures why the priesthood of the Roman Catholic Church are sodomites. Thanks for listening today. I'm glad to be your host. I'll continue with the reading and discussion of this book tomorrow on Inquisition Update. We'll see you tomorrow.
Visit crosstheborder.org, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. That's crosstheborder.org.
I know you all want answers, and believe me, so do I, and I'll do my best to get them.
Despite Nicolas Cage's promise to do his best to get left behind rapture answers for us, don't hold your breath. Not everyone believes Left Behind is true prophecy. Some may even regard as conspiratorial the mainstream re-release of the Left Behind movie with actor Nicolas Cage portraying the main character as an attempt to further reinforce in the minds of all this perception of false prophecy in order to condition the masses for the play about to begin. If you want true Bible prophecy answers, get the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. The author exposes the Latin rapture origin, the 7-year tribulation deception, true Bible revelation of Daniel's 70 weeks, the abomination of desolation, the restrainer, America in the Revelation, the image of the beast and the mark of the beast, and the truth about God's chosen people, and so much more about Bible prophecy. This book will shatter the Left Behind paradigm of future events. Get the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. Visit crosstheborder.org, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. That's crosstheborder.org.